How to Build a Multi-Billion-Dollar Business in Africa from Scratch by Strive Masiyiwa. Compiled by Geoffrey Tengamba, being read to you by Arnold Rangakuramia. Chapter 17, My Battle Against Corruption in Business. We would not as Africans need aid from anybody if we tackle corruption. No child would sleep hungry if we tackle corruption. There would be no injustice if we tackle corruption. Every child will be in school if we tackle corruption. The most powerful force against corruption begins with one person saying no. Saying no to corruption. One of the questions I'm often asked by people who want to invest in Africa is how I deal with people demanding bribes. My answer is really quite simple. I have never had any difficulty with saying no. Corruption only occurs at the point you decide to participate. It takes two. There is the one demanding it and the one who pays it. And really, this is how we fight it, each one of us saying no. For me personally, dealing with corruption has never been difficult because of my faith. In my own mind, to quote the Apostle Paul, I am fully persuaded that there is no person or force in the whole universe that has the capacity to stop something which God has given me. This is a deep, deep conviction for me. I believe that I will never be disadvantaged because I walked away from a corrupt deal. In fact, on this the Bible is very clear. If I walk away or lose anything because of my conviction that it is wrong, God will replace it with something much bigger and better in this life. That is Mark chapter 10, verse 29 to 30. Sometimes I have been viciously persecuted because of my stand against corruption. At other times I had to wait for years because some corrupt individual or individuals were blocking our way. And always I prevailed because faith abides. It never fails. Ironically, some of the worst corruption I have witnessed was not in governments, but in the private sector. Some of the most corrupt people I have known were not Africans, but we as Africans must take responsibility individually and collectively to fight corruption. I could write a book about what happens to you spiritually when you accept a bribe or offer one, but I would not do so today. And for those of you who do not consider the spiritual perspective, let me rather respectively say this. We would not as Africans need aid from anybody if we tackle corruption. No child would sleep hungry if we tackle corruption. There would be no injustice if we tackle corruption. Every child will be in school if we tackle corruption. The most powerful force against corruption begins with one person saying no. In one country, we had a contract on which we earned over $30 million a year. It was very important for our business. Two very powerful politicians demanded that I pay them a bribe of $8 million to keep the contract. I refused. They had our contract cancelled and we were thrown out. They then replaced us with one of our largest global competitors from Europe, whose executives immediately paid the bribes. I reported them to the United States Justice Department as they were listed on the New York Stock Exchange. They admitted that their officials had paid the bribes and fired the officials. They then left the country. One of the politicians was later indicted for corruption and is now serving a 13-year jail sentence. Years later, we returned to that country and we are now building again our presence in that wonderful country. In another country, we submitted a tender on a privatization and we were recommended as the best by the international investment bankers advising the government of that country. The deal was worth hundreds of millions to us. We waited and waited for an announcement, but none came. Then I was invited to the State House. The son of the president asked for a 20% stake in the exchange for us being given the award. I refused and withdrew our bid. I have no regrets. When the president had lost an election, we returned to that country and got an opportunity to set up, and we are now doing very well. In yet another country, a retiring African president invited me to come and see him. He told me he had heard a lot of good things about our company. He said he wanted to issue one more license before he left office, and he felt that we should have it because we were an African company. He then suggested that I find a way to accommodate him quietly offshore as he needed something in retirement. I politely told him that I was not interested in the license. We are yet to return to that country, but we will one day. In one of Africa's most respected countries, a policeman asked me for my driver's license as I drove to church one morning with my family. I told him that I had forgotten it at home. He said that I had committed an offense, which I immediately accepted. Instead of giving me a ticket, he suggested that I pay him something. I refused. He then threatened to arrest me, and I said it was fine, and he could go ahead. Several of his colleagues surrounded us, even verbally abusing me and saying I would be deported because I was a foreigner. I kept quiet. I never raised my voice or was animated. I simply asked that they either arrest me or issue me a ticket. After a while, they said we could go. I refused and insisted they ticket me, as they had an obligation to do so under the law. Now they were totally terrified. We have continued to prosper in that nation, but I never forget to carry my driver's license when I drive a car. Each one of us can play our part in getting rid of corruption. After this, Felix often sent for Paul and talked with him because he hoped that Paul would offer him a bribe. That is Acts chapter 24, verse 26. Paul wrote more than half of the New Testament. His stand against corruption was amazing. Corruption is not new. When the apostle was held as a prisoner at Caesarea, he could have been released if he had agreed to pay a bribe to the Roman governor, Felix. Paul came from a rich and noble family. He also had rich friends who were concerned about him, including the writer of Acts, Dr. Luke, and his wife, a businesswoman called Lydia. There is no doubt that if Paul had asked for money to pay the governor for his freedom, it could have been found. Instead, Paul chose not only to stay in prison for another 2 years, but he preferred to go to Rome in chains, where he would be tried and face the death penalty. When I first read this and reflected on it, I was deeply moved in my spirit. As my pastor likes to remind us, brothers and sisters, this gospel of Jesus Christ came to you by the blood of other fellows. Don't take it lightly. Here was Paul risking his life when all he had to do was pay this Roman governor and get his freedom. And I hear so many people say things like, this is how things work around here. We have no choice. How else are we going to get those contracts? How are we going to feed our families? When we were thrown out of the country after I refused to pay the bribes that could have saved our contract, I knew exactly what it would cost us, both financially and in the jobs of over 200 people and their families that were forced to leave. Of course, there is a price to pay. Look at Paul. Mine was nothing. Corruption will end in Africa when some of us say enough. I don't care that I have to walk to work. I am not getting on a taxi that pays a policeman a bribe at a checkpoint whilst I watch. I am not going to give my cousin a job in government because he is my cousin. I am not going to take a bribe when I am a judge in a court case. I am not going to pay a customs official. I am not going to pay anyone a cut for a contract, even if it means I am out of business. And when we do this, one morning we will wake up and find there is no corruption in our society and there are no corrupt leaders, because if there are corrupt leaders, they come from our societies. Let's start a movement across Africa of ordinary citizens who will wear a badge that says no to corruption, just like we wear badges of our commitment to fight HIV or AIDS, because corruption kills more people in Africa than HIV or AIDS. Nothing does more to damage Africa than corruption. Africa will not reach its full potential unless we deal with corruption. The majority of Africans will not be prosperous unless we deal with corruption. Now, before I get into this topic, let me make it absolutely clear that corruption is not an African phenomenon. It is found everywhere. I have dealt with instances of corruption in America, Europe, India, China, Papua New Guinea, and in the Middle East. Just about everywhere I've ever been, I have seen corruption. Some of the most corrupt people I have ever met in my life were not Africans. Corruption is not color, it's not religion, not gender, it's not age. Corruption is corruption. And make no mistake, both the giver and the receiver are corrupt. Some of the most corrupt people I have met were very poor, while others were very rich. Corruption is corruption. Corruption comes in many forms and guises. The truth is, many people are engaged in forms of corruption without even knowing it is corruption. Corruption has many names, including fraud, theft, kickbacks, bribery, stealing, bid rigging, vote buying, nepotism, patronage, tribalism, racism, graft, embezzlement, price fixing, protection rackets. These are all names of forms of human depravity we call corruption. Corruption does not just occur in government, it happens also in the private sector and even in not-for-profit organizations. A policeman who demands a tip at the roadblock is just as corrupt as the minister who demands a multi-billion-dollar bribe. I'm yet to find a verse in the Bible which says there are different hells. Just one, and they will both end up there. As a new generation of entrepreneurs, we must pledge ourselves to play by a different set of rules. If we want to change the cycle of poverty in our beloved continent, we have to say no to corruption. Your fight against corruption will cost you something. It will cost your friends, it will cost you projects, it might even cost your business. It might even end up costing your life. Corruption will not end until there is a generation prepared to pay the price to end it. What did Martin Luther King Jr. say? There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must take it because his conscience tells him it's right. The word corruption comes from the Latin word corrumpere, which can mean to bribe, but also to mar, destroy, rot, seduce, tempt, contaminate, or infect. What does corruption mean to you? Winston Churchill said that courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. Let's talk about it. A brush with President Charles Taylor of Liberia. When you're setting up a cell phone network, one of the most critical faculties you have to build is what is known as the switch center. This is where we house the huge complex of computers that process calls coming in and out. The equipment is housed in highly secure buildings that cost millions. It takes months to prepare such a facility before you can even install the equipment. In 2001, after we got the license in Nigeria, we set about trying to find a building big enough to house the switch facilities in Lagos. It was not an easy task to find the right type of building, and time was running out. We had paid $285 million for the license and had been given 6 months to set up our operations. Failure to meet the deadline would have resulted in a loss of the license. Then one day, our estate agent came and told me they had found the perfect building. It was actually the Liberian Embassy building in Lagos. The government of Liberia, then ruled by Charles Taylor, wanted to sell the building and move to the political capital, Abuja. It took only a few days of our people to reach agreement over the price. Sale and purchase documents were drawn up and payments were prescribed. It was a lot of money, which meant I would have to personally sign off the payment. As I sat there in my office in Lagos looking at the documents, I noticed the payment had to go to an account in Switzerland. Why is the money not going to Liberia? I quizzed my staff. It seemed to be a detail no one had picked up. Is it really our business where they want the money sent? Someone asked. I refused to sign. The ambassador came to see me in my office with an entourage of officials. There was a sense of urgency on their part. I explained to the ambassador that I wanted the government of Liberia bank account number, and I also wanted a cabinet minute authorizing the sale. A cabinet minute usually covers essential matters for consideration by government minister, such as purpose, recommendation, background, and options. It records the outcome of the cabinet's consideration of the previous week's cabinet committee decisions. He seemed to agree that my request was reasonable and promised to cooperate. The following day, he called me and said the president's brother had been dispatched to sort out the misunderstanding over the account details. Ambassador, there is no misunderstanding. This is government property, and all I want is the necessary documentation to show that the sale has been formally approved by the relevant authorities, and I want an account in Liberia. He was now getting quite desperate and agitated, even suggesting that they had another buyer in the wings. I would not budge. On another occasion, he invited me to travel to Liberia as the guest of the president. He thought it would impress me. Sometimes, not always, corruptors try to dangle the flattery of high-level meetings with top leaders or their close family members to reel you into their illegal activities. Sorry, Ambassador, I replied politely but firmly. I have a network to launch. We have paid $285 million for the license and have a tight deadline. Please give me the documents I need. Of course, by this time I had long worked out what was happening and was already looking for an alternative building. I let them stew for a few days, then told him I was no longer interested and moved on. We ordered specialized containers to store our equipment and air freighted them to Lagos. It was a more costly solution than if we had just bought the Liberian Embassy building. Many years later, Charles Taylor was forced to hand over power to his vice president after a civil war in which tens of thousands of people were killed. He was eventually sentenced to a total of 50 years in prison by the United Nations-backed Special Court for Sierra Leone near The Hague in the Netherlands for his leading role in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other violations of the international humanitarian law. You want me to be a commission agent? We want you to be our local partner, he began. You are smart, you have lots of friends in government across Africa. Where there is a tender which interests us, we'll call you and we can work it out together. We will pay you a 10% commission on every deal that we win together. The company he worked for was a big and prestigious one. It is one of the largest in Europe. The gentleman talking to me was a director, and he had traveled all the way to see me. What happens if your tender is not the lowest? I asked quietly. Then you must do everything to make sure we, that is you and us, get it. He smiled. You want me to be a commission agent? No, he said. Our local partner. I could see I was making him uncomfortable. We make only the best equipment. This Chinese stuff is rubbish. Ours is the best, but you know it costs a little more. That is why we need someone like you with a little influence. I looked at him. You are looking for a commission agent. I don't do that kind of business because it means that somewhere along the line I will be required to cut deals which are corrupt. His face turned red, then white as a sheet. Then he got up hurriedly and left my office. He could hear me laughing loudly as he left. Commission agents. Know them for what they are. There are some countries where all business is done through the so-called commission agents. This is organized corruption. Don't admire people who make money as commission agents, despite the conspicuous consumption that often follows their way of life. Commission agents are not entrepreneurs. Also, be wary about companies that simply want to use you as an agent and middleman. That is not entrepreneurship. The business of providing access is one of the worst forms of corruption. Large international companies that have the so-called local partners whose role is simply to provide access to the right people are not innocent of corruption, even though their fancy lawyers might say otherwise. Let's play by a different set of rules. Let's keep corruption and corrupt practices out of Africa. An indecent proposal. It is one of the most exciting markets in Africa with a growing, robust economy and a fairly large population. Everyone wanted to get into that market and the door had just opened for us. I decided to handle it personally. I knew the minister very well, said an old friend of mine who was an influential businessman. I can set up a quiet meeting so you can make a pitch directly on your company's capability. We met in a hotel suite in the country's capital. The minister was much older than I, but we hit it off straight away. He was well educated, sophisticated, and had traveled the world. You're just the kind of guys we want here, he said. I like the fact that you guys are African. Music to my ears. We continued to talk. At some point, our interlocutor conveniently left us alone, and then suddenly, out of the blue, the minister said, Personally, I don't like having shares. I prefer cash. I think $3 million is okay. I have a good relationship with the president and I'm allowed to run the show completely. I can get it done in a matter of weeks. I was totally speechless. Finally, I managed to tell him that I would need a few days to think and get back to him through our friend. And then I left as quickly as I could shortly after that. Once out of the country, I never spoke to either again, despite their efforts to get hold on me. I completely stayed away from the country and never considered getting in again for years. For weeks and even months after that, I had many sleepless nights. I was really angry, but not with the minister and the interlocutor. I was angry with myself. Every night I would toss and turn thinking about that meeting, and all the while I kept asking myself the same questions over and over again. What could I have possibly said in that meeting that could have led the minister to think that I would accept such an indecent proposal? Why didn't I just tell him there and then that this is corrupt and unacceptable? The answer to the second question was simple. Fear. I feared that I would not be allowed to leave the country given how powerful he was. The first question was much more profound and led me to change the way I approach my own business dealings and meetings with powerful officials of this kind. I realized that by agreeing to meet him quietly outside his office, I may have signaled to the corrupt man that I had come to do business his way. From that day, I was to avoid such meetings, insisting on formal contracts with other officials present. Going to a public official's home or meeting him privately outside their office should be discouraged by anyone wanting to uphold their integrity and that of those public officers public office holders. I went further. I no longer seek personal business meetings with either. I went further. I no longer seek personal business meetings even with the head of state. I see lots of presidents and ministers, but I don't discuss with them my personal business interests anymore. I can discuss broad issues of industry and economic policy. I don't discuss things that are specific to my company or business. If I have a complaint related to my business, I prefer to send my officials or to put it in writing. More often than not, I prefer to discuss issues of global development, philanthropy, or humanitarian interests. Last year, I traveled to Nigeria to see the head of state, and we discussed agricultural development in my capacity as the chairman of AGRA. We also discussed how to grow more children. We also discussed how to get more children into school, in my capacity as the member of the Global Business Coalition for Education. We also discussed how to get more children in school, in my capacity as the member of the Global Business Coalition for Education. A few months ago, I led a group of philanthropists to Kenya. They wanted to donate philanthropic money to provide solar electricity to the poor. It had nothing to do with my business interests or theirs. We also visited rural communities and listened to problems they have as a result of lack of electrical energy. Would you go to see President Obama to discuss setting up a business in America? Of course not. So why the obsession to see presidents in Africa with our own personal business interests? The fact that so many people do it does not make it right. This does not mean business leaders should not meet politicians, but we must be careful about why we go and the perception we create. For economies to boom and people to prosper at all levels, we need consistent, transparent policies that apply fairly to all engaged in the enterprise, including state-owned enterprises. We also need vigilant citizens who know that those policies are and do their part to stop the rot if they see it. We also need vigilant citizens who know what those policies are and do their part to stop the rot if they see it. When one of the bidders wrote the actual bid document. It happened to me once. It happened in Zimbabwe when we were fighting for the license to operate. After the Supreme Court first ruled that the state monopoly in telecoms must be ended, the judges then ordered the Minister of Telecommunications to issue a cell phone license by public tender. The judge gave a deadline by which it had to be done. A few weeks later, a tender was published in the newspapers by the minister. A few weeks later, a tender was published in the newspapers by the minister. We had no choice but to participate in the process. We wondered at the time how the minister had managed to prepare the tender documents in such a short time. Little did we know that the bid documents had been prepared by one of the participants. On the day of the closure, there were 4 bidders and they placed us last of the 4. On the day of the closure, there were 4 bidders and they placed us last of the 4, awarding the tender to a company controlled by a well-known African businessman. The minister appeared jubilant with the winner and announced the new era in telecommunications. After the announcement of the bidders, I met with my lawyers and we decided to urgently petition the court to undertake a judicial review of the award of the tender. Few people at the time appreciated the existence of this procedure on a public tender. Our lawyers approached the court and asked that all documents used in the award process be put under court seal. When the order was granted, our lawyers rushed to the place where the tender adjudication committee had been holding their meetings and asked the court officials to place all documents, including any notes of the members of the committee found in the room, under court seal. It happened so quickly that no one had the opportunity to hide anything. Months later, when the hearing was due to start, lawyers from both sides were allowed to study the sealed documents. Amongst the documents found was a telefax draft document of the original bid document. It had been sent to the chairman of the committee by the company that was ultimately awarded the tender. The date on the fax showed that it had been sent before the tender was published. During the process of marking, our company had mysteriously been docked points to ensure it came last. When we showed these documents to the judge, he cancelled the license and licensed us instead, and we had actually won, even the rigged tender. The minister in question accepted the decision of the court and we were allowed to operate. However, she went ahead to reinstate the license that had been cancelled by the court to the bidder that had cheated so blatantly. No member of the committee, including its chair, was ever asked to explain. Amazed? You should not be. This kind of things happen all the time. The rule of law drives investment. If you don't meet my demands, I will have to throw you out of the country, the man shouted at me over the phone. He was the chairman of our local partner in Kenya. This was after I had asked him to put up his share of the investment into our joint venture. It was more than 10 years ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. Building the network was going to require over $100 million in shareholder funds, that is equity. Our partners, who owned 70% in terms of the agreement, wanted us to put up the entire $100 million, even though we would only have 30% of the equity. This had not been our original written understanding when we bid for the license of a public tender. I suggested that we find other partners in Kenya who had the money to meet their investment obligations, but the partners refused. We were appealed to the regulator. When we appealed to the regulator to let us bring in new partners, the Minister of Telecommunications stepped in and began to support the position of the local shareholders. I knew that legally the minister was overstepping his role. It was also clear to me that he was not acting in a rational or fair manner. By the time of that phone call, the stalemate had been going for months. Numerous meetings to resolve the issue had come to nothing. We were going in circles. After the phone call, I wrote a letter to our partners and told them they must put up their share of the money or they would have to accept dilution. It was Friday. The following day, a Saturday, I was walking my daughter, then infants, in a local park in South Africa when I got an urgent call from our staff in Kenya. The minister has issued a statement in which he has cancelled our license and ordered us to leave Kenya. Do you have a copy of the statement? I asked him calmly. Gather the legal teams and we fly to Kenya right away. By 10 o'clock Monday morning, we had been slotted for appearance before a judge of the High Court of Kenya. An hour later, the judge issued his ruling. He reinstated our license and rebuked the minister in open court. The minister appealed the ruling of the judge and the higher court of judges threw him out of court. During the appeal process, the minister sent an envoy asking me to come and see him to resolve the issue. I refused, saying, all he needs to do is to publicly withdraw his invalid statement and withdraw his court application. Not long after the minister was dropped in a cabinet reshuffle, I was later told the president of the country at the time had slammed the minister for sending the wrong message to investors by behaving like a cowboy. Fast forward. One day, I was in my office many years later when we got a call from a very large global organization. It was their legal department who said to me, we are planning to make a very large investment in Kenya. As part of our due diligence, we are looking at the rule of law. Would you mind sharing with us your experiences in terms of how their court system works? Our lawyers shared with them our experience, together with our recommendation that they invest in Kenya based on the strength of its legal system Our lawyers shared with them our experience, together with our recommendation that they invest in Kenya based on the strength of its legal system to protect investors. Soon after, they set up their investment. You see, how a country's legal system works is very important to how investors perceive risk in a country. These days, investors have access to decisions made in your country's courts. During due diligence, they study these judgments carefully. They also study press statements made by those in leadership and talk to other investors who are already invested in your country. No serious investor simply puts up money without looking into the rule of law in a country. What exactly do I mean by rule of law? Aristotle said more than 2000 years ago, the rule of law is better than that of any individual. It means that government officials are held accountable under the law, that laws are just and applied equally to all, that laws protect everyone's fundamental rights, that the legal process is fair and efficient, and that courts operate with independence and integrity. Kenya is a country where we have invested heavily over the years. We continue to do so with great confidence, and for me, it was the strength of the judicial system when it comes to protecting investors that has been the key. End of chapter 17.